Hello my friends, and thank you so much for joining me. The video that you're about to watch is a recording of a series of classes that I delivered on Buddhist philosophy during my time in the Shaolin Warrior Monk program. The recording has been edited for the sake of brevity and the enjoyment of an online audience. So with that out of the way, please relax and enjoy the video.
Alright, let's kick off. Thanks for coming, guys. Thank you for joining my class. Today I'm going to talk to you about emptiness and non-self. So the idea here is I'm going to try to start with the kind of largest concepts, the most philosophical, if you will, the kind of nature of reality, and then try to whittle it down to the most practical. So we kind of go from like the worldview, reality, or what I call like metaphysics, and then kind of break it down into like epistemology or like knowledge, what we know about the world, and then what you should do about it. So that's kind of the way that I've structured these classes. So these are kind of abstract concepts, so bear with me. If you don't enjoy philosophy, too bad. I should have called this like philosophy of Buddhism, but I like the philosophy stuff, so I thought we'd start there. And so, our first topic. Has anybody heard of this word before? Emptiness in a Buddhist context? Yeah, it gets thrown around a lot. I think it's kind of mean to start there. It's like quite a mysterious concept. To kick it off, I'm going to do a quick reading. This is the Heart Sutra, which is probably one of the more important sutras. If you haven't got a handout, perhaps you could just pass one along or share with the person next to you. Okay. The Bodhisattva of compassion, when he meditated deeply, saw the emptiness of all five skandhas and sundered the bonds that caused him suffering. Here then, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness no other than form. Form is only emptiness, emptiness only form. Feeling, thought, and choice, consciousness itself, are the same as this. All things are by nature void. They are not born or destroyed, nor are they stained or pure, nor do they wax or wane. So, in emptiness, no form, no feeling, thought, or choice, nor is there consciousness. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no colour, sound, smell, taste, touch, or what the mind takes hold of, nor even act of sensing. No ignorance or end of it, nor all that comes of ignorance, no withering, no death, no end of them, nor is there pain, or cause of pain, or cease in pain, or noble pain, to lead from pain, not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. So know that the Bodhisattva, holding to nothing whatever, but dwelling in prajna wisdom, is freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it, and reaches clearest nirvana. All Buddhas of the past and present, Buddhas of future time, using prajna wisdom, come to full and perfect vision. Hear then the great Dharani, the radiant peerless mantra, the Paramita, whose words allay all pain. Hear and believe its truth. Gate gate praga. Okay, guys, so the Heart Sutra is probably like one of the best known sutras in all of Buddhism because it really is literally laying out their entire worldview of like the nature of things. But who was kind of confused by that? Like, what are they actually saying? Yeah, right. It's like saying like everything is empty, nothing. So what does this kind of mean? You know, it's not to say that nothing exists because, you know, here we are right here sitting in a room. Clearly something exists, but they're saying everything is empty. So what does this actually mean? In order to get like a kind of better grip on this idea, I'll just use the example of like the table, for example. So what actually is a table, right? It's wood, right? We all agree that this is made out of wood. I'm not 100% certain, but it certainly looks like it, right? So wood is basically made of like carbon and hydrogen, the protons, electrons, neutrons. We've heard about all this matter and energy, right? And when you kind of boil it down to it, it's basically made of space, you know, like as in space existence itself. You with me? Mm-hmm. So really, if a table is just space, how is it different from anything else? Because everything is kind of made of atoms, right? So what actually differentiates the table from like the air around it? It's just a different arrangement of matter and energy. Yeah? Yeah, fair enough, right? So we have a word for it. So I can say, look, a table, and you can be like, yes, I see the table, but table is just a word, right? The table itself, what is that? So it gets kind of tricky when you say that, like, well, okay, the table is a particular arrangement of carbon and hydrogen, but then, like, so is a tree, and so is the air, and so is everything around us. And I'm not even sure, like, this table is not even like a static thing. Like, it's slowly decaying, and like over time it will rot and it will fall apart. And so, like, at any one moment, at like the molecular level, it's breaking down and changing. So, like, it's not even the same thing right now as it was when I first asked you, what is the table? Okay. So the kind of conclusion to this problem is that, like, there literally is no table. The table is a word that we use, and we look at it and we ascribe it certain meanings, but in terms of its own self-nature, there is no table. Like, the table doesn't exist in any sense outside of our eyes and our mind and our words and our language of community. So I'm not saying there's nothing here. There's clearly something here. I could kick it and it would hurt my shin, you know. But the table, the word, the idea of the table, that's the kind of challenge that I'm presenting. So if you think about another example that I like is, if you go out into the ocean, right, you see there's all these waves, and I can look at the wave and I can ride the wave and surf and it can dump me. So it's very real. But at the same time, the wave is literally just made of water. It's part of the ocean. It's not actually a separate thing. I can't pick the wave up and be like, here you go, here's the wave. It just doesn't make sense. So it's better to think of the wave as a kind of feature of the ocean. Do you get what I mean? Another great example is like a hill. You can think of, like, the hill clearly exists because I have to walk up it, but then, like, can you actually find the exact line where the hill stops and then the land starts? Like, maybe you could, but you would be making a judgment, because it's actually like a smooth gradient, and so it doesn't make much sense to be like, oh, there's an exact line. And so in the same way, it's like, oh, well, really the hill is just a feature of the land, and so actually I could just say that the mountain is just the earth, and the earth is just part of the cosmos, and all this sort of thing. So all of our definitions kind of collapse away. So this is the Buddhist claim, right? That when I look at a table, yes, I can feel it and I can touch it and I can label it, but that it as a table has no intrinsic nature. And the fact that we think the table exists is merely an illusion called Maya, which is actually the name of a demon that kind of eludes us. But really the main idea is that because we have language and we're always pointing at things, we believe that they really exist as a separate individual entity. But I'm not saying that there's nothing there. Okay? So emptiness is not nothingness. They're different. I think the simplest way of explaining emptiness is saying that things lack intrinsic nature. That, like, the table, as I said, is just an arrangement of matter and energy, and it will perish, and it was once a tree, and the tree was once the earth. So things just kind of change, and there's nothing that can be, like, pinpointed as a table, right? And so once you kind of, like, accept this, if you accept this, of course, you realize that, like, everything is like this, literally everything. There's nothing that kind of escapes this. So then you start to say, oh, okay, so everything is kind of like this. It's all just a kind of ocean of arrangements and waves. They arise and then they fall. Everything around us is like that, just on a much slower time scale. But if you were to look at, like, a time lapse of this area, like billions of years, you would see the earth moving like this. Literally looks like an ocean. So the conclusion there is that, like, everything is actually one sort of thing, right? It's actually a continuous flowing sort of stream of reality, space and time, and that things only appear to us, but really they're actually temporary, and that if we can accept this, we will realize something really fundamental about the kind of nature of reality and ultimately ourselves. So all is one. Sometimes the word used is suchness. It just is, but there's no real nature. There's no labeling. It's very difficult to practically live in a world where you think, oh, there is no table, it's just an arrangement of matter and energy. And as Ellie has rightly pointed out, it's a convention. If I refuse to acknowledge the existence of tables, then I'm going to have a hard time explaining, like, where you should sit when you eat food, you know? So the emptiness thing is like really a comment about, like, our language and how it creates this illusion of separation in the world, that all these things are separate things and that they're somehow separate from us. And what I'm really kind of leading to is, like, the identity stuff, and that's when it becomes really important for enlightenment and how we think of ourselves. But it is quite metaphysical in the sense of, like, the nature of things. So it's not the same as nothingness, because that's absurd. It's literally absurd to say there is no thing, because I'm sitting here, you're sitting here. But when you try to say, what is a table, you start to run into some troubles. Like, yeah, anything can be a table if you start putting things on it and start using it as a surface. And likewise, when you take them away, if I smash this in half or if I burnt it, it wouldn't be a table anymore. So it seems like this is a pretty fluid kind of definition anyways. You actually reminded me of a pretty useful idea. So another way you can question what a table is if you say, well, what if there was literally no human beings in existence? There was no animals that had eyes. Let's say there was only non-living things. So there was only rocks and stars and whatever else. Does the table still exist? Or is it now just, kind of a thing? Do you get what I mean? So it's only sort of becomes a table when you have a human being that's like, there's a table. So we create it, as exactly as you said, we are creators. When I look at something and I label it, I'm bringing something into existence. But the idea here is that's kind of an illusion, and ultimately it leads to suffering. So it's very useful to name things, because then we can talk about it. And I can be like, hey, look at your watch. But if you were like, what's a watch? Then, I wouldn't be able to communicate. So it's very important to be able to, acknowledge things. I was going to say, in terms of this question, something you often hear for Buddhism is that the only intrinsic property of reality is change. So there's nothing else that you can assign to it. Literally nothing lasts. They reckon the universe started off as like a big bang, like something the size smaller than a molecule, and now it's all this, and nothing really has stayed the same. Nothing. Everything has changed. There's an old kind of, I think it was Heraclitus, is a Greek philosopher, and he said something like, no man enters the same river twice, and it's not the same man that enters the river, which is kind of easy to understand, because like the river is obviously flowing, and so even moment to moment, all the molecules are moving. So you're never really doing the same thing when you enter the river. But actually, he wants to say that all of reality is like that. Like even at this very moment, everything is changing, including the table and the air and your bodies. So the only intrinsic property of reality is change. But does that change? That's a little bit of a brain twister. We won't get into that. So reality is change. All right, let's kind of move on. I'm sure you can kind of see where I'm going with this. The next kind of logical conclusion is to apply this kind of conundrum to yourself. So if there is no intrinsic nature to things, then do you have an intrinsic nature, or in a sense, are you empty as well? So we can do the same exercise. We say like, well, what am I? And this is also why meditation is so good. You can ask yourself when you're meditating, like, what am I? And go deeper and deeper and deeper and see what you find. And like the Buddhists, although this is quite different from the Hindus, so that's really interesting. The Buddhists will say nothing. Like there's like when I really go deeper, like there's kind of a void. Like I can't actually find a nice little ball of light. In Harry Potter, when the Dementors are attacking Sirius Black and there's this little ball of light that comes out of his mouth. And I think it's quite a Christian idea that like you have a little ball of light inside of you, which is like a God spark, and that's your soul. The Buddhists would say that's not there. So really you're kind of just this meat suit and you walk around. So what am I? Well, I'm kind of organs and tissue, and I'm muscles and sinew and all of that, which is what was all of that made out of? Well, it's made out of like food and water and the things that I eat. But ultimately, again, we get back to like it's made out of oxygen and carbon and hydrogen and all of that stuff. And back we come to matter and energy and space. And so how am I any different from anything else? And in Buddhism, they would say you're not. It's just a very, very convincing illusion that you are. Consciousness. And I don't assert this with any level of like, this is not a settled question. I don't want to make it sound like this is authoritative, but the Buddhists would say that consciousness is like a very, very complex manifestation of, go back to the river example, of the river, If you look at a river, sometimes it forms little whirlpools. Have you guys ever seen that? Mm-hmm. And they kind of last for a while and then they dissipate. So they're kind of rare and unstable. And I kind of think consciousness is a lot like that, because human beings are quite fragile. I think it was like Richard Dawkins talked about like, if you get a little puddle of water on the earth and you have the right molecules in it and you shine light on it for long enough, eventually it comes to life. And that's kind of the best we have with respect to the origin of life. So it's literally just like you make a soup and then you shine light on it and eventually like it starts to grow. So it's like, it's the weirdest thing. Like it's almost like a property of nature itself that like once you have a planet, you get water and then you get life. which is really weird because most of us like to think that life is like separated, natural and life, and these distinctions. So I appreciate I probably haven't convinced you that you don't exist, but if you think about yourself and you say, like, what am I? How do I know that I am, Daniel? What is Daniel? And you could say, well, I have a body, right? Like this body is here and it's real and I exist and I've existed for like 26 years, is it? Yeah. So, but even that doesn't really solve the problem because like some of you might have heard that the body replaces every single atom in the body changes every 5 to 7 years. Most of them, like 98% of them change every, like, I think it's 1 year. I think it's your teeth that last the longest. But in case you didn't know this, your teeth are metabolically active as well. They're not just there and they stay the same your whole life. So your bones and things, they're actually metabolizing too. So every single atom in your body has changed since you were born. Nothing that you were when you were born is still there. So are you the same person or have you completely changed? So that's kind of like difficult to justify. Even though I have a body, it is like a river too. It's just changing and, The other idea is like psychological continuity. So like I am Matt because I remember me. I was me my whole life. And like I was me when I was 2 years old and I'm me now and I'm the same guy. There's a few problems with that too. Like for starters, I've kind of forgotten most of my life. When you think about it, you forget like 99% of your entire life. Probably more. And the other thing as well is like if I start to lose my memories or like I get like some kind of cognitive decline, am I still me? Most people would say, yeah, you are. Like I still love you or I care about you. Or no, yeah, maybe not. Some people might actually say, no, you're not. So it does get kind of tricky. The other example you commonly hear is like amnesia. Somebody wakes up with amnesia and I don't even remember my own name. I don't remember my childhood. It's like, do I cease to be the same person? And maybe like in one sense I do, but then in another sense, legally I'm still the same person. You would still see me as the same. You're not like, well, who's that guy? I don't recognize him. You do, right? But all of these things kind of break down when you consider all the different things. Every night we go to sleep, we forget who we are, kind of like we forget where we are and wake up in the morning. You're like, oh, I'm here, like it can be really disappointing or it can be a relief. So I'm basically trying to get at the question is like, if you are a self, like how are you a self and how does that continue over time? And can you point at what it is? If every single atom inside your body changes and you don't remember most of your life, then what about you is actually like carrying on? It's kind of difficult to answer. So the claim in Buddhism is that your individuality is actually an illusion. And you are kind of like a little whirlpool in a river that sort of emerges naturally as a property of the river, and then it sort of dissipates eventually, and back to the river you go, which is why you hear about this idea of reincarnation, that there are different versions of this, but basically the idea is like I came from nature, I sort of coagulated and formed into this human being, and then I will die, and then that will kind of pass on and carry on, and so on and so forth. But the claim is exactly the same, that you exist, I can poke you and say there is something there, but in the same problem that we had at the table, there is nothing that I can say about you that is intrinsically true for all time that doesn't change. There's that thing again, reality has changed, you are changed. That's the only thing about you that's kind of consistent. No atoms, no memories, everything changes. The claim is kind of here that something exists, but really it's only one thing. There's kind of only existence itself, which we're going to call oneness. So oneness is, or suchness, sometimes they call it suchness. It's a weird word, but I quite like it. Suchness just is, or isness, you can say that too. And then you're just kind of part of that. So you have the perception that you exist and that you're separate, but really it's just a demon called Maya who's deluding you. There's also, there's definitely like properties that you can assign. People behave certain ways. People are observable, right? The claim is like a very precise idea that although you exist, you're just not individuated from the rest of existence, that things are actually all connected. And I'm going to kind of leave it there, but the reason that I wanted to kind of like bring this into the conversation early is because it sets up a lot of the Buddhist ethics, which is based a lot on compassion. And compassion is kind of when I say, do unto others as I would have them do to me. But in Buddhism, it's even more kind of connected, when it's just like you are the one who's being harmed, because we're all connected. So if you harm another animal, you're like kind of harming yourself. But you don't need to think about that in an egoistic way. At the end of the day, if you buy into this, the ego itself kind of dissolves, which is also really important for Buddhist enlightenment. And that's connected to so many other things about like craving and desire. And now you're really getting into the kind of lifestyle of Buddhism. But if you don't accept this, then this whole kind of like, have any of you heard of ego death in the context of like psychedelics or like any kind of like near-death experience, when somebody feels like they're connected to God or they're connected to something much larger? It's a very similar idea. It's like that your ego is this kind of box. It's like, where am I? Well, I'm kind of in here, aren't I? But if we can get out of that, this idea that actually you're connected to something larger, and the Buddhists would say, like, not only you are connected, but you are something much larger. And when you think of yourself as this kind of ego inside of a skull, it's a very limited view of what you are. And the claim is that this is a form of enlightenment. And then also they would say this is very blissful realization, that like, I feel very liberated from this. Because then we'll cover this next week. But when I say that I'm different to you, like I can compete with you, and maybe I like that. But then like at the other end, maybe I don't. Like maybe I feel envious. Maybe I'm frustrated. Maybe I want to be better. Maybe I want to steal your lunch, So all this kind of conflict arises from the separation. And in the Buddhist kind of philosophy, they say that's all an illusion. And if you can actually realize that you're all one, then so much of that kind of just doesn't make sense. Thank you so much for going, guys. Go get some rest. You're welcome.